Hi, and welcome to the third and final episode of Qualifying for Climate Justice. I am your host, Lily Barraclough, and today we are discussing the relationships between feminist and queer conceptions of space and place in geography and sustainability transformations. I am thrilled to welcome our guest, Zwena Gray, the founder of Queer Ecology Hikes. Zwena is a storyteller, adventurer, and community cultivator with a deep love for nature and connection, who offers hikes, workshops, and speaking engagements that connect communities to land and to one another through the lens of queer ecologies. Welcome, Zwena. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. It's very sunny outside, so I'm happy about that.
My first question to you connects to what a prominent queer geographer, Eden Kincaid, speaks about in a lot of their work, is that space is never neutral. Why are queer ecology hikes important, and how do they connect to this idea of how queer and trans people move through space?
I want to speak to that idea about space is never neutral. I think queer ecology is all about being in relationship, the fluidity that exists in all the relations. So not only within our human relations, but even in our relationship to space, our relationship to culture, our relationships to our family, like all of those ways that we relate. And much like in relationships, the space that we're in impacts us as much as we impact the spaces that we exist within as well. And so I think that's why space is never neutral, is because we're in a constant relationship and constant conversation with the space around us and impacting the world that we exist in. And I think queer ecology hikes are important now more than ever with like the use of technology, social media. At least for myself, it feels sometimes as though there's like a lot of angst existing in the world, where it just feels like, oh, like there's so much tension, like everything is like really heavy right now. It can feel really overwhelming. And so what queer ecology hikes do is allow us the space and giving the permission to be still, which you would think is counterintuitive to the idea of a hike, right? Because it's like most people, when they think about a hike, it's like, oh, I'm getting from point A to point B. But queer ecology hikes are more so about like the connections that we create to each other and to the land. And so it's allowing space for that stillness on like a mental, spiritual, and emotional level, and also allowing time to ask those questions and to question the spaces that we exist within and like how we actually move through them. Like, why is this trail here? Was it always here? Who existed here before we were here? What could the story of this land could have like looked like 100 years ago? What could the story of this land look like 100 years into the future? So it's like this, also this like beautiful way of like bringing in collective visioning, which I have found like to be so like beautiful, like being able to facilitate those spaces and to like, it's given me a lot of hope, honestly, as well. So I think like for me, like queer ecology hikes have acted as a vessel for like hope. And on the other side of that hope, like to hold space for the grief of like what we're journeying through collectively, like as humans together right now. And how do queer and trans people move through space? Well, I think like the answer to that is like nuance, because every person is like, I think another thing is that queer ecology situates queerness not only as an identity, but also as a way of like being, and a way to like a framework for like through which we can interact with the world. And so with that framework, it allows us to like, I guess it allows our queerness to like bloom in a way that is beyond like one identity or like one way of existing, but rather it allows us to see ourselves reflected within the world, which is like also, it kind of allows nature to be a mirror. So it shifts the perspective from like a window as like, oh, nature is something that like I look at and that I observe kind of like a zoo, and it shifts it into like a mirror in the way of like, oh, nature is reflected in me and I am reflected in nature. So it creates space for like, again, like it opens the door for that conversation.
Speaking to some of the work that feminist economic geographers Julie Graham and Catherine Gibson explain when talking about human nature relationships, quote, belonging to the world as one does to a family, suggesting an affect of love and an ethic of care, one that seems to go both ways, end quote. So I'm curious if you want to build on this sense or experience of becoming and belonging with nature, and how that relates to experiences of queerness.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting that you like pulled this, because I'm actually currently reading Bell Hooks All About Love, and I feel like it ties in really well to this quote that you pulled here. And it kind of talks about the shift from like love being like a feeling to like the act of love, and also that like to fully understand that feeling, how we also have to understand like where love was lacking, or kind of like to fully understand like our grief. And so I think like similar to this thing of like belonging and like what does it mean to experience or sense belonging? I think we have to like go back into like genetic and ancestral and like memory ways. And like I think the idea of belonging also requires us to remember. And I think specifically like speaking from my personal experience being like someone that like ancestrally has experienced like displacement, uh, from like the continent like of Africa to, well, that I grew up born and raised in Detroit. I think that like that sense of belonging and like the idea of that is always it's a really tricky question. Because where do I feel belonging? Like do like belonging like in a physical sense, like on the land, belonging like with my family, like in my home. I feel like I feel the most sense of belonging is like when I'm around my family. But I also think that like so much of like this idea of belonging is not always tangible. And also nothing, I think what nature teaches us and reminds us is that also like nothing is permanent. So like that all these feelings that we have are not something that we can ever hold on to. So like though the feeling of like belonging is like a beautiful one and one that like feels the most like loving, like I said, like I feel the most sense of belonging around my family. I also like not that same sense of belonging, like existing in the world. There's still so much like lessons and like beautiful challenges and like growth that I get from existing outside of that comfort space of belonging. And so I think that like there's so much that we can learn from like nature and like and when we bring in queerness as well and like that idea of like chosen family, I feel like that also speaks really well to that like idea of belonging is because you might not always belong in the spaces that like society tells you that like you should belong because you were born into it or that like maybe like you belong there because like that's the location that you were born. There's kind of this like skill or this again remembering of like, oh, we can build wherever we go and that like we can create. And I think that like ability to and that understanding of like, oh, I can build these things and that this these feelings of like love, belonging, of like care that we find along our like life paths also reminds us of like this beautiful future that like we can not only imagine, but it's actually like tangible for us to get to. And so I think like that's kind of the connector for me is like shifting like the imagination from this like dreamscape to also realizing that like the what we imagine is just the goal, but there's actual steps that we can take to get there. And I think like we're seeing that like currently in our world. Like I've seen like so many things change. Like I think even if we just look at like a year, we see it go from like at least here like in Canada, we see it go from like fall to winter to spring to summer every year. Like that's immense change from having like 3 feet of snow on the ground to like summertime. Like there's a sense of wonder there. And like, at least for me, like every year, I'm like, even when I'm like super cold, I actually love winter more than I love summer, but, there's a sense of like wonder within that change. And I think that like the world and like nature is such a great teacher for us. And I think if we like slow down and like listen to all the lessons that are like around us that nature has to teach that we can really, that is what will lead us to that like imagined or dreamed, future. Um, yeah, I really love that question. So thanks for that.
I really love your answer. So I want to turn now to kind of the relationship between these local grassroots initiatives and the broader context of sustainability and addressing the climate crisis. Within sustainability transformations research, there's an emphasis on the role that grassroots seeds of a good Anthropocene illustrate and embody new ways of being in the world towards the development of a better Anthropocene instead of the current one of destruction, extraction, and injustice. And I'm curious how you see your work with Queer Ecology Hikes and similarly other like local context and relationship-based initiatives as contributing towards this broader good future.
Yeah. I think that's something that particularly initiatives like these, like my Queer Ecology Hikes, what they do is they don't like is not giving people like this is the one solution, like as a monolith, because that being like there is one solution, that's not a queer perspective at all. But what it does instead is say, here's some options. Here's a question. What do you think? It's an invitation rather than it is a solution. I think there's like something very powerful about like inviting people into a space where we can like collectively do something together. And for that person to also think about like what the solution might be for them. Because truly, like, there is no like one solution. There is no like one fix. And so I think that initiatives that allow people, like, number one, for community to come together is like amazing. Allowing people the space to just like talk to other people, like to connect. Two, initiatives that allow people to like the space to kind of like question and be critical of the systems that we're existing in. Particularly outside of like digital space as well, is really amazing. And then lastly, I think allowing like the multiplicity of experiences, because I have people come on the like hikes that have like never gone on hikes. I have people that like love to go hiking and like are very like avid hikers. I have like people who are like, oh, I didn't think I would like love this at all, but like I really enjoyed it. Like having like a multiplicity of like yes and, rather than saying like, no, this is not it, but this thing is right. So I think allowing space for that multiplicity when we're creating transformative futures and like also like action items for like toward the climate crisis is like really, really helpful, because oftentimes like what that giving like one solution does is it excludes other people based on like race, like social economic status, gender, like transness, queerness. Like it can be really exclusionary. So I think allowing people the space to choose what works for them and giving options and letting people know like there is enough for us all. There is enough here. Is really powerful.
There are so many different ways that people are feeding into, the revolution or the movement, that are crafting, different ways of being and relating together, and that there is no one way, and it is a conglomeration of many different ways of being and knowing. And I think you kind of, you answered most of my final question around like what a queer perspective can bring to the idea of sustainability transformations. But I want to leave it open in case there's anything else you wanted to delve into about this relationship between queer ecologies and sustainability transformations, or, anything else that we've talked about today.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've heard the most from participants like post hikes, was recently I started doing some of my interviews with people who have come on the hikes. And it's been really amazing to get some feedback. And something that I've heard the most was this idea of like, so an activity that I'll do on the hike is kind of like have people talk about like, what's a sound that you hear in a place that feels like home to you? And what's that, like, say that sound phonetically. So some people will be like, tweet, tweet, or cheeseburger. And well, they'll say different sounds that they hear like around their like house. And I had one person that gave feedback and they said something, they were like, when you did that activity, it made me feel as though like I didn't need to know the scientific name of what was in like the animals or the plants in my neighborhood to realize that I did have a relationship with these beings. Because sometimes like what can feel like the barrier is being like, oh, I don't know that's a red squirrel, or I don't know that's a chickadee, so therefore I don't know anything. And people kind of just end it there because it's like, oh, I don't know anything about this thing. Like, I don't even know what that sound is. But kind of having the ability to be the expert of where, like, and to kind of have expertise and a level of pride in the place, like whatever is your home to you, to be like, oh yeah, the bird that lives on my corner makes a cheeseburger sound, or the bird that lives on my corner makes a tweet tweet sound. And to have that be like validated and something that people can learn from. And so I think like that's been one of the like best experiences for me leading these hikes, has been being able to see the like light in people's eyes to be like, oh, I know this bird or I know this thing. And not because like I'm telling them, oh, this is a chickadee or this is this bird. That's not the point. It's more about giving them asking them the questions to make them realize that all the answers that they already want are there if they like listen for it. And so I think that is like really, I just wanted to share that moment because I think it really reflects the the beauty of what this entire process has been for me, and like also how that that like line, and I don't even want to call it a line, that spiral and like blooming of question asking for me has really opened up my relationship with the world around me these past 3 years leading the hikes. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's so true. We're the experts of our own experience. So with that, I want to thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me and to share some of your work and your thoughts about these important concepts and experiences. Hi, and welcome to the second half of this last episode of Qualifying for Climate Justice, focused on the intersections between feminist and queer geography and sustainability transformations. I was so thrilled to have the wonderful conversation with Zwena Gray of Queer Ecology Hikes pertaining to the real-world implications of the ways in which queer and trans people move through space and how that connects to experiences with the more than human, with the natural world. To start off my discussion of how the literature and research relates to my discussion with Zwena, as well as within the context of the intersections between sustainability transformations and feminist queer geography, I want to start with the key root causes that the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES, the leading scientific authority body on the biodiversity crisis and the intersections with the climate crisis, and the producers of the Transformative Change Report, identifies the root causes of the intersecting biodiversity and climate crises as disconnection from and domination over nature and people, alienation from self, others, and nature. And really emphasize that we need critical perspectives to create new pathways towards sustainability. And so what I'm interested in discussing today is the ways in which feminist and queer perspectives of space and place can address these root causes of biodiversity, as well as support the development of new pathways towards sustainability. It's key to note, however, that both feminist and queer geography and sustainability transformations face some of the same challenges in terms of operating within the existing Western colonial Eurocentric system, takes systemic transformation and overhaul towards a more equitable and sustainable future. And these key root causes also translate into leverage points, ways in which people, actors can influence the system to change, to transform towards a more sustainable and equitable future through reconnecting people to nature, restructuring institutions, and rethinking about how knowledge is created and used in guiding humanity towards sustainable systems thinking. And this is framed by the authors Abson in 2017 as well as West in 2020, really emphasizing the ways in which we can shift from this controlling, violent, fearful future of apocalypse to one of relationality, hope, caring, and emancipation, which is, integrated into the work of Schoons as well as Fiola. And I think what is critically important here is the ways in which we do that. In Zwena's interview, she speaks a lot about the ways in which bringing queer folks out into the nature with a wide variety of experiences with hiking or being in the natural world helps facilitate feelings of joy, wonder, curiosity, and confidence of their own knowledge and their own self-experience. So much of our modern world is entirely disconnected from the natural world. We sit at computers all day in desks inside large office buildings. But there are ways to notice the small facets of the natural world that creep in to our everyday lives, whether it's the birds that you can hear out the window while you're working at your desk, or, the small dandelion forcing its way through the asphalt at your work's parking lot. And part of what Zwena does with the Queer Ecology Hikes is really encourages people to witness and experience and be mindful in their experience and outside. And I think that is also what we need to think about how we create new pathways towards sustainability. so much of our existing system of response in terms of climate change and biodiversity crises are focused on urgency, immediacy. Although these are life-changing, life-altering, threatening problems, we have found already that the emphasis on technology, on using existing capitalist economic systems to address these crises have not worked. The world has known about climate change for a long time. It has been evident how our actions impact the natural world. I think this connects as well to the ideas of decolonial sustainability transformation scholar Graham Hassan on decolonizing transformations through the idea of right relations. And this is focused on, instead of critiquing problematic relations, focus on developing ways of having good relations with both each other and the natural world, our more than human kin. And they emphasize the importance of listening deeply, self-reflexivity, creating space, being in action as continuous processes of becoming with no endpoint. And this really connects to queer theory and this idea that gender and sexual identity are not fixed. They're ever changing and shifting. They're contextual and place-based. And this idea of, performativity in terms of the ways in which our genders are made through our performance, and gender being a socially constructed phenomenon, which is, comes out of the work of Judith Butler, but is adopted and critiqued by the queer feminist geography collective, as well as other prominent queer geographers like Larry Knopp, and really looking at the fact that queer and trans lives can foster multiplicity of ways of being that both create and disrupt space and place. They can chart lives of mobility and constraint and foster life-sustaining relations with others. And there's this concept as well of queer time, which originates from the works of Halberstam, but has been integrated into, queer geography in some of the work from Lim in 2007 and Eden Kincaid and the Queering Feminist Geography Collective, in that queer time operates outside of the privileged and respectable temporalities of maturity, adulthood, marriage, parenthood, and as well because of the experience of the AIDS crisis, of losing so many of our kin within the queer community. There's a real emphasis on living in the present, building relationships and friendships beyond identity, creating found family. And these are skills in which the broader society needs to adapt to this rapidly changing climate and the rapid, destruction of our democracy, as well as to create new alternatives and build new worlds that are based in decolonial relations, queer relations. And this is why, as Eden Kincaid and Sharp describe in their new book chapter on queer and trans space, that queer ecologies and queer and trans lives can trouble these binary distinctions that shape the ways we view our relationship with the natural world by troubling these false binaries of nature and culture, human, non-human, body, and the environment, and really emphasizing that, nature and culture are inseparable, as well as humans and more than humans, and that our body is so much of how we experience the natural world and the environments in which we live, and that queer and trans people and communities make place in unlikely spaces where, might be viewed as discarded weeds or marginalized, and can make affinities with overlooked plants and landscapes in these hybrid edge liminal spaces. And this is something we need to consider as our lives become ever more unstable and uncertain, is that we need to build systems of resilience where we can shift and imagine different ways of being and knowing together. And this is also critical in thinking about, prominent theories that connect to queer queer geography, as Lim stated in work in 2007, Deleuze's queer theory of affect looks at how bodies being any material object, affect other bodies and may be affected by them. And this came up in my conversation with Zwena in terms of the ways we are in constant conversation with the space around us, and we're both impacting the world we exist in and we're being impacted by it. And these can lead to new modes of practice in relating to other people, places, situations, and material things, multiple possibilities, and really making visible our interdependencies, working towards just outcomes, and finding new ways to live with the earth. This comes up a lot in the work of feminist economic geographers Jager, Gibson, and Graham, in which they speak about the importance of collective actions bringing new worlds into being that have more than humans at the center and have multiple positions and motivations that coexist, speaking to this reality of queer experience of shifting between different spaces and places. And they really emphasize the importance of figuring out how we can survive together well and equitably, distribute surplus to enrich social and environmental health, encounter others in ways that supports their well-being as well as ours, maintain, replenish, and grow our own natural and cultural commons, invest our wealth so that future generations can live well and consume sustainably. And they also emphasize the need for feminist critique to push us beyond these binaries of human and non-human, subject, object, economy, and ecology, and really shift towards an economy and relationship with each other and the more than human of connection, not separation, and interdependence, not autonomy. Other authors, draw on the work of Donna Haraway in framing the Chthulucene, in which entities are no longer separated into these false binaries or categorizations, but instead are viewed as intercultural, genderqueer, human and non-human entities. And I want to end off by, sharing this statement from Gay Antari in a work on the manosphere and the ways in which sustainability science is focused on hypermasculine views of the world and relationships, in which science is a situated and ongoing social practice. And I think that's why it's so important when we think about sustainability transformations and the ways in which we are, adapting to and mitigating climate change, that they are not objective. There is no one size fits all. There is no one right way to do it, because it's so contextual and it depends so much on the local context, the realities of the people involved, and science is not objective. It ultimately is derived from the system in which it is enacted. In most cases, that being a Western, imperialist, Eurocentric, Anglophone-centric institution like universities. To end off, ultimately, I think queer and feminist perspectives are what we need in this time of disruption, change, crisis, and the need for new development of alternative pathways towards just futures. Because queerness and critical feminist perspectives can teach us to move beyond our existing state, our existing system that we live within, and really shift. It's stated in the IPBES Transformative Change Report, views our ways of seeing, thinking, and knowing, structures, the ways of organizing, regulating, and governing, and our practices, our ways of doing, behaving, and relating to one another. Because we can state these all we want, but if we don't have insight as to how we actually change these aspects of our lives and our world, we're not going to be able to. And I hope I've illustrated here today some of the ways in which a more queer and critical feminist lens can shift the ways that we view structures and practices within our lives. Thank you so much for listening.